All right. Well, welcome back, everybody. Welcome back from your break. Hopefully, it was rejuvenating. And we are really excited to have you all back for our last panel of the day. Not the last event of the day, but the last panel. And how apropos that the last one is about punk presence and future. So, we will be contextualizing all of these rich conversations we've been having all day by looking back at some punk histories that paved the way to where we are today, and we'll be looking forward to futures where punk as a way of being in the world can take us. So definitely check out the Discord to get all of the great bios for everybody. I'll be introducing everyone one at a time, but we will be learning about punk magic, punk music, cyberpunk, and popular punk praxis. So it should be a really great panel. So we will start out with Mikael Sebag. So I will hand it over and we will be hearing from him.
Thank you so much. All right, let's see if this works. Pulling that up. Are you able to see my speaker notes?
Yes.
No.
I'm sorry.
That's. What about now?
I think you got it this time. Oh,
All right.
no, I
No?
spoke too soon. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
drat. Let me try. I'm so sorry. We even troubleshooted this beforehand, of
Don't
course.
worry, it happens all the time.
All right. Uh, Screens, application windows. Just this application. Oh dear.
I think you got it this time for real.
Well, now I've lost my speaker notes. I'm so sorry. I'm setting us all back terribly.
Oh, don't stress. It's totally fine.
Oh dear. Okay, stop. Uh, I will make up for it by speaking quickly.
You're really doing okay. Don't worry. Exactly. Someone in
There's
Discord
that.
says, "What would a digital conference be without tech troubles?"
Are you able to see my speaker notes?
Unfortunately, yes.
Unfortunately, yes. All right. We are going to try something slightly different. I will just put it on my phone.
Oh, that's a good workaround.
So if you see me looking away from the camera frequently, you will know why. All right. So, hi everyone. My name is Mikael Sebag. I am currently a PhD candidate at the University of California, Irvine. I'm also an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Southern California. I'm pulling up my notes as we speak. Oh, goodness me. I was so hoping it wouldn't be me too, right? All right, show speaker notes. Here we go. We're going to do our level best and see how this goes. So, welcome to Generation Hex, Gutter Magic, Punk, and Enchantment in 90s role-playing games. So today I'm going to be arguing that Gutter Magic in the 90s role-playing game Mage the Ascension, when understood through the lens of Jane Bennett's theory of enchantment, is a punk act of political resistance. But first, some history. So the 90s were a time of sea change in the publishing history of the tabletop role-playing game. And while the decade neither witnessed the birth of the role-playing game genre like in the 1970s, nor did it see the meteoric rise in the genre's popularity as we have over the last 10 years, the 90s did give us the World of Darkness. In 1991, White Wolf Publishing published Vampire the Masquerade, its flagship RPG of what would eventually grow into a shared universe that featured werewolves and mages, ghosts, and numerous other entities besides. This shared universe was called the World of Darkness, our world, only darker. And what is so exciting about this world in particular is that even though we're going to be talking about mage, there's all these other things going on in it. So we're actually going to start with vampire because it was responsible for launching the company's success and for establishing the world of darkness as having a very specific default gothic punk tone. So as opposed to in D&D where you sort of like grab your longsword and put on your best wizard hat, in Vampire the Masquerade, you are playing the role of an immortal being living under the radar of modern society. You have vampiric powers that you use to try to survive the night. You shape mortal affairs from the shadows. And above all, you try to maintain your humanity as you do this. There were previous games like Nightlife that played with similar themes, but Vampire seemed to really resonate with people. In when you look at the Designers and Dragons book series and you look at the entry for the 90s, and this is a series of books specifically about the commercial history of tabletop role-playing games, you can see that there is a werewolf and a vampire on the cover. Like that's just how decade defining this whole game was. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the World of Darkness became an extremely popular platform for LARP. And we can kind of credit Vampire with some measure of responsibility for shifting the contemporary discourse around the RPG medium to also include and take seriously character driven narratives. While Vampire was rather specifically influenced by the Gothic romances of Anne Rice, the whole World of Darkness wasn't just Gothic, it was Gothic punk. But what does that specifically mean? Well, according to the White Wolf Wiki, Gothic punk is a phrase that describes the mood and themes of the classic World of Darkness. The Gothic punk milieu is a film noir environment, a dystopian world of extremes. The bureaucrats are all corrupt, the rich are filthy rich, and the homeless clog the streets. So while the setting's Gothic side brought to the table melodrama and eroticism and the macabre, it was its punk side that brought conflict, anger, and critique. And it's that very punk ethos that actually took the core metaphors at work in each game and transformed them into political statements. In Vampire the Masquerade, players were often pitted against much older, much more deeply entrenched, and more powerful vampires who were able to get away with unspeakable abuses by dint of their wealth and their social connections and offices. In Werewolf the Apocalypse, lycanthropes rage against a spiritual avatar of greed and corporate corruption, and they fight to forestall the looming specter of climate crisis. In Mage the Ascension, the awakened characters war against a crypto fascist and technocratic agenda whose agents use misinformation to sow distraction, complacency, and docility within the sleeping masses. So, yeah, on the whole, the World of Darkness games are quite political. They're angry and loud, and they have something to say. And something about this punk ethos, something about these mature, angry, sexy little games really seemed to resonate with people in the 1990s. So much so, in fact, that by 1995, White Wolf had become the second biggest RPG publisher in the industry after TSR. This was a major upset and fairly unprecedented. Another key to its success, though, was the fact that the World of Darkness games kind of focused on the highs and lows of urban life. Vampires tended to congregate and hunt in major metropolitan cities, and the other game lines then also followed suit and focused on the metropole as the dominant setting. Even in Dungeons and Dragons, with its presumed focus on wilderness exploration and on dungeoneering, it's kind of like in places like Sharn and Waterdeep, where the more interesting things happen. So, given this urban focus, it should then also come as no surprise that the World of Darkness focuses a lot and at times even glamorizes themes of poverty and homelessness. Each of the game's settings has like one of its factions as a sort of stand-in or as an entry point to experience to sort of move through the experiences of unhoused individuals. Though the sort of in your face, the commitment to in your face grittiness in the World of Darkness games also meant that some of these depictions are at times, oftentimes, quite inelegant. Vampire had its sewer dwelling Nosferatu, Werewolf had its urban scavenger Bonars, and Mage had the Orphans. These were characters who were never formally initiated into a tradition of magical practice, and they had to sort of figure things out for themselves. And while these depictions are indeed kind of reductive and exploitative at face value, focusing on the crisis of urban homelessness was actually a major part of White Wolf's political critique of modernity. It showed how ancient and oppressive hierarchies would never really disappear unless they were actively dismantled. It showed how the promise, the empty promise of endless corporate growth would never lead to endless prosperity for the rest of us. It showed how data without responsibility, advancements in technology, but no advancements in democracy would never actually lead to a brighter future. So it's poverty tourism, yes, but with a critical intent. And in the case of Mage, given its titular emphasis on magic, it should kind of come as no surprise then that people who lived in the gutters would practice something called gutter magic. After all, when you don't have a formal education, magical or otherwise, and you don't necessarily even have a roof over your head, what do you do? Well, according to Mage, you do it yourself. You make do, you make magic. The first reference that I could find to the term gutter magic appears in Destiny's Price in December of 1995. This was released under the Black Dog Game Factory imprint, which was the mature content line for a company that already kind of focused on mature themes quite a bit. So you can imagine how gratuitous it got. The term comes up again in November of 1998 with the Orphan's Survival Guide, which we'll actually get into in just a moment. But for now, I think it's kind of more productive for us to take a sort of holistic view of gutter magic and understand it retrospectively. So in the 20th anniversary edition of Mage of the Ascension, this is how they describe gutter magic, looking back. Composed of odds and ends with symbolic connotations, gutter magic features coins, cards, toys, scraps, bottles, cans, nails, junk, graffiti, and things crafted out of the cast-offs of consumer society. Dead TVs, old magazines, cardboard boxes, gnawed chicken bones, sacrificed rats and alley cats, old clothes repurposed and restyled with feral urban flair. Such instruments direct the will of the truly destitute. And in the spirit of Mage the Ascension's freeform magic system, this is kind of the long and short of gutter magic. For any spell that you might possibly conceive, the gutters provide, assuming that you can sort of ascribe and discern these symbolic connotations in these odds and ends. If you look at the Orphan Survival Guide, though, even though this has a very freeform magic system, there are predefined spells called rotes, and they're sort of strewn across all the different mage books. But the ones that we find in the Orphan Survival Guide speak rather specifically to the material and social circumstances in which orphan characters, gutter mages, might find themselves. Rote like Ratstorm allows you to befriend and slowly build an army of urban wildlife, while a rote like Passing allows you to physically change your body in order to pass safely, to avoid hate crimes on the basis of outward manifest properties like race or sexuality. And rotes like these, while kind of inelegant perhaps in their design, also speak rather unapologetically and candidly about the uncomfortable realities of those living in extreme precarity. As you've likely already noticed, gutter magic is, by its very nature, punk. It's an approach to magic that's born of the margins, it's DIY, and again, it's quite unapologetic in calling the world out on its shit. It's a paradigm where the mage has license to give a symbolic meaning to a cigarette butt or an empty fast food container, to decide for themselves the ultimate and transcendent meaning of these cast off and repurposed objects beyond their instrumental value as commercial goods. In the freeform magic system of Mage the Ascension, gutter magic thus allows you, the player, to decide if a nearby beer bottle represents the body of an oncoming attacker, or if a mural in a public park is a literal gateway to another world. As a player, you then get to see what happens when you break that beer bottle, or when you attempt to step through that mural. And to me, that's not just punk, that's enchantment. I will back up for a hot second, but I do promise this is going somewhere. So, particularly in its earliest editions, Mage the Ascension was very concerned about the threat of disenchantment, and it loomed large in the game setting. High above the affairs, the daily affairs of those struggling to survive on the margins, in the meta plot of Mage the Ascension, four factions war over the dominant narrative that governs reality, something called the consensus. And by default, the prevailing consensus in the world of darkness was that there was no such thing as magic, that the world was no more or less than what it appeared to be, that there were no witches or wizards, morality was a social construct, and everything was in principle quantifiable and ultimately knowable. Put another way, the unawakened sleepers of Mage the Ascension, for them, the world was a place of metaphysical realism, ontological homogeneity, value nihilism, and epistemic overconfidence. This was what the German sociologist Max Weber referred to as die Entzauberung der Welt, the disenchantment of the world. But back in 1917, when this theory emerged, Weber wasn't talking about the world of darkness, he was talking about our world. And while there have been multiple scholarly attempts to sort of challenge, contradict, or complicate the modern disenchantment narrative, one bears special relevance for us today. That is the 2001 monograph by the political philosopher Jane Bennett, The Enchantment of Modern Life: Attachments, Crossings, and Ethics. Bearing in mind its publication date, she likely wrote this during the 90s as well, so that's fitting. Here, Bennett argues that enchantment is still within reach. Enchantment is a sense of openness to the unusual, the captivating, and the disturbing in everyday life. For Bennett, disenchantment isn't a pathology of the modern world, but rather a symptom of our inattention to it, the remarkable callousness with which we can move through the world. And this disenchantment has ethical consequences. Disenchantment entrenches the affective flatness upon which exploitative, extractive, and authoritarian orders depend so as to maintain our complacency and our complicity. By contrast, enchantment provides us with the fuel that we need to remain intellectually and emotionally engaged with things like civic imagination or ecological stewardship or mutual aid. Moments of wonder provide the affective force that propel us to ethical generosity. And to cultivate our attention such that we're ready and open to receive these sources of emotional renewal when they unexpectedly appear is imperative for us. Without honing the necessary perceptual refinements, we drift through the world as it appears to us, which is dead, alienated, and ultimately unworthy of our attention. So for Bennett, the world isn't disenchanted. We are. But through this conception of enchantment, we find new ways of apprehending and assessing meaning. We cultivate an ethical consciousness that can be reasonably maintained for the long haul without burning out and just giving up. And we don't have to look to great works of art or transcendent mystical experiences to find these sources of ethical renewal. We can look to the others. We can find enchantment in things that are quiet, quotidian, and even grotesque. Either in spite of or because of the looseness of Mage the Ascension's magic system, the practice of gutter magic makes Bennett's conception of enchantment a literal reality, using metaphor to distill the abstract notion of meaning into the concrete stuff of magic. Gutter magic allows players to abjure the wastefulness of corporate excess and to instead cultivate deeper affective attachments to the world around them in ways that commodification will not, cannot account for. Other games were picked up on Gutter Magic later, some other games that were in the 90s as well, like Unknown Armies, which has a similar improvisational rough and ready approach. And it even comes back in the form of Thin Blood Alchemy in the 5th edition of Vampire the Masquerade, where you can use things like street drugs or hand sanitizer or felt markers in order to work vampiric magic. Mage the Ascension is often described as the most hopeful of the classic World of Darkness games, and Gutter Magic captures that sense of hope quite beautifully. Though it's considered a marginal and peripheral practice, Gutter Magic distills the urban punk aesthetics of the game world and articulates its core political message. We are still enchanted. The world still has magic in it. You get to decide where that magic is and what it does. You have a voice, and you get to be the one to choose what you do with it. So what are you waiting for? Get out there. Make some magic. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mikael, for starting us off. Despite the technical difficulties, it went perfectly smoothly. And you're definitely striking a chord with folks. People are waxing rhapsodic about World of Darkness and all the games we miss from the 90s. All right, if you all have questions for Mikael, we're going to answer them at the end, but feel free to start putting them in the Q&A box. Otherwise, we're going to move on to our next presentation, and I'd like to introduce Drew Borecky, who will be talking to us about Fuck the Rules, may contain effing and jeffing, and I will hand it over to him.
Hello. Thank you, Emma, for your introduction. Let me share. Okay. First of all, I want to thank Analog Game Studies for having me again for another year. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't thank the strong National Museum of Play in Rochester, who I did the majority of the historical research on a fellowship provided by them last summer. And this is a small part of my dissertation. on literacy, music, and tabletop role-playing games. So let's get started. The sound of screaming guitars, the image of leather and spikes, and the call to tear down the system all evoke the idea of punk culture and punk rock. Historically, creators and writers in the TTRPG industry have leveraged these ideas to inform their creation of games in the various punk literary subgenres and subsequently deployed their versions of punk music to their audience. In doing so, TTRPG creators and games such as R. Talzorian Games incorporated Cyberpunk, the role-playing game of the dark future, and Tim Roberts' Punk is Dead, a post-apocalyptic songwriting TTRPG, use social constructions of punk that include being anti-system and providing mutual aid. These appear alongside evocations of punk sounds via musical language and recordings to inform and manipulate the musical literacy of their players. By drawing on research in game studies, music studies, as well as archival sources, I argue that TTRPGs such as Cyberpunk and Punk is Dead rely on a quote-unquote social index of punk to evoke their game worlds, while promoting their own versions of a punk musical literacy. By doing so, players are encouraged to contend with, consider, and renegotiate popular conceptions and histories of punk music, and, by extension, develop their own punk literacy. Most TTRPGs include musical content. This content ranges from being able to play a musically proficient character to being provided the cost of a musical instrument in a game manual. In terms of musical literacy, the creators of TTRPGs use musical ideas, concepts, and genres to enhance play via musical interaction. I used philosopher Gerald Levinson's discussion of the musical literate, which is not based on informational recall of music theory or terminology, but contextual understanding based on an internalized norm. The broadness of this definition, namely the evocation of the norm, extends to any facet of music. Levinson names style, genre, and form specifically, but I extend this to encompass cultural knowledge, extra musical meaning, and social interaction. The formation of literacy is fraught and messy. What certain sounds mean and which sounds to deploy to convey that meaning are tied up within the cultural memory of players and creators. As a result, TTRPG writers attempt to harness musical literacy by drawing upon musical ideas about genre, time period, cultural background, etc., that can be tied up in a musical habitus. While Bourdieu's theory of habitus is primarily based in social theory, musicology and media studies have used habitus as a framework to explore how social environment and personal history affects personal taste and musical bias. While habitus is as unique as personal literacy, I deploy it here to reference something closer to general consensus, or what is purported as consensus in a reductive manner. As music is often ancillary to many TTRPGs, many authors forego musical nuance in favor of a generalized summary, purported as fact and informed by popular conception, thus creating an amorphous, internalized norm. These norms are deployed as something to build on during play, and in some cases altered without context in order to promote certain musical literacies, primarily through the social construction of musical genre, as well as exploring musical styles and forms. For example, R. Talzorian's Cyberpunk draws on and creates a musical literacy based on punk music and culture to enhance their dark and dystopian streets of Night City. Coined by author Bruce Bentke and popularized by sci-fi writer William Gibson, cyberpunk as a literature subgenre is, quote, characterized by countercultural antiheroes in a dehumanized high-tech future. The players of Cyberpunk the game perform as these countercultural antiheroes in the form of mercenaries, hackers, investigative journalists, as well as political dissident punk musicians called rocker boys and rocker girls. Described as street poets, social consciences, and rebels, the rocker boys and rocker girls of Cyberpunk are distinct from corporately owned rock stars by virtue of their musical activism. The image and practice of these musicians relies heavily on the social and political aspects of punk as a musical genre. In terms of genre, music scholars such as David Brackett and Guthrie P. Ramsey Jr. have explored the musical and social dimensions of genre. In his work, Brackett traces the history of genre via the early music industry, where recording companies create a one-to-one correspondence between the social connotations of the music and its audience and performers. While Brackett does this to address the influence that genre has on musical creativity, I contend that this concept operates similarly in the formation of musical literacy, wherein conventions and sonic markers are continuously inscribed on the listener and then reproduced in their own understanding. This also extends to extra musical and social meaning. Ramsey Jr. addresses the social baggage that comes with genre, stating that, quote, the concept of genre operates as an index of sound and the social ideas assigned to it. In other words, people socially agree on what sounds mean and to what community they quote unquote belong, and what extra musical connotations they might convey. The writers of Cyberpunk, for example, rely on their social construction of a social index of punk that is built through their resonances with the genre that they evoke in their game. Listeners often conflate social constructions of punk as a genre with the political dimensions of the punk discourse. Punk scholar Kirsty Lohman's examination of Dutch punk subculture portrays the punk discourse as broadly anti-system. This is broadly construed due to a lack of an agreement of what system is being evoked, but regardless, punk ideologies are steeped in the ideas of resistance. So cyberpunk's rocker boys and rocker girls utilize punk methodologies and mindsets such as DIY music production and pirate radio that blast their music right in the faces of the corporate authority, echoing the politics of anti-capitalist and anti-corporate resistances of punk ideologies. Interestingly, these social indicators of punk are contradicted by R. Talzorian's musical evocation of hard rock by providing a list of musicians as examples while doubling down on a punk anti-system framework, stating, as a rocker boy, you know it's your place to challenge authority, whether it's straight out protest songs that tell it like it is, or just by playing kick-ass rock and roll to get the people away from the sets and into the streets, capital S. You have a proud history as a rocker boy. Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen, The Who, Elvis, the Rolling Stones, the legions of hard rock heroes who told the truth with screaming guitars and gut honest lyrics. Now, none of these artists can be attached to punk either musically or sonically. Further, each of these names occupies distantly related subgenres of rock that can only be tied together under the broadest definitions of rock music. However, each of the listed artists were initially perceived as countercultural to existing power structures during their respective eras. Further analyzing their list, Dylan, Springsteen, and the Stones each have notable and iconic protest anthems. At the same time of Cyberpunk's initial publication in 1988, Elvis had been recently inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and was lauded for his impact on the physical expression of music. And while each of the above can be connected to revolutionary and anti-system workings, The Who are left to take up the mantle of just playing kick-ass rock and roll via their well-documented loud and raw performances. The writers of Cyberpunk use the above musicians to evoke quote-unquote hard rock heroes, as well as the social dimensions of punk to create a rocker boy, rocker girl genre for their high-tech corporate dystopia. In terms of promoting a particular musical literacy, Cyberpunk pulls heavily from the social habitus of punk music and culture in terms of social ideologies. However, while R. Talzorian mines the social index of punk for extra musical meaning, they promote a musical literacy that strips punk of its sonic identity. Rather than attribute a punk sound to identities such as Iggy Pop, The Clash, or the Sex Pistols, they opt for more commercialized names that fall into a more hegemonic habitus. There could be many reasons for this choice that return to punk social life, including the rift between American and British punk scenes, or the issues of actual punk bands being too controversial to be viewed as monetizable during the late 80s. Regardless, as players use this information to reinscribe their literacy, new sounds and different names become associated with the sonic and cultural conventions of punk through TTRPG play. Cyberpunk itself encourages players to engage with this literacy by putting sound into practice, stating, get out your heaviest rock tapes and play them during your run. Encourage players to wear leather and mirror shades, adopt the slang, and invent your own. While it's difficult to imagine ascribing the word heaviest to the music of Dylan or Elvis, R. Talzorian advocates for the players to engage with what they conceive as appropriately quote-unquote punk in their understanding of the genre. Cyberpunk's attention to music is typical for TTRPGs that include music as an inspiration for their world, but only in what it can lend in terms of atmosphere and meaning, especially for the earlier days of gaming history. Recently, with the wider success of TTRPGs, other creators have dug deeper into how musical literacy can be deployed more directly in terms of style and form. Presenting as a less dystopian and more post-apocalyptic, Punk is Dead by Tim Roberts takes UK punk aesthetics and turns them up to 11. Uh, Billed as a companion to the recent post-apocalyptic heavy metal or doom metal inspired hit Merkborg, Punk is Dead has the players form a band and tour across an undead-ridden, ununited kingdom to play epic gigs and write songs. In contrast to cyberpunk, punk music and the cultural practice of punk communities is the focus of TTRPG play in Punk is Dead. In addition to focusing on punk music, Punk is Dead deploys punk ideologies in all aspects of its production. By leveraging gratuitous profanity in its writing and utilizing full spread punk visuals from clothing and hairstyles to an anti establishment pop art. While similarly drawing on the anti system sentiments deployed by Cyberpunk, which was observed by Lohman's examination of Dutch punks, and that the social indexing of punk as a genre, Punk is Dead also places hope at the center of the musical TTRPG. While the sentiment of music being an effective force for good can be viewed as uncritical in academic writing, punk communities and scholarship have documented how themes of existential distress and disaffection in punk music brings together those who feel hopeless and through mutual aid find hope. While evoking this punk theme, Roberts ties it directly to punk history by placing this passage directly above an image to a ticket to the Clash's final concert held at the Majestic Performing Arts Center in San Antonio, Texas on May 22nd, 1983. Although this is the only mention of a historical punk band, there's little debate on where the Clash reside in terms of musical genre, tying it closer to a punk literacy that is based in punk culture. These attributions of punk combine with further evocations of musical ideas as each player takes up a role in the band and has abilities that tie in with musical performance to fill out a robust punk musical literacy. Roberts then takes these components and provides incentive for players to engage with their understanding of the genre through songwriting. In the section entitled Songwriting Performance, Robert combines the different threads of TTRPGs, punk ideologies, and music practice into a set of guidelines for musical creation. In what I interpret as following the OSR trend in TTRPG design, as well as an adherence to anti-system ideology of punk culture, Robert directs players to write music on their own, stating, F the rules, there are no mechanics for songwriting in this game. However, the band and band members are rewarded with creativity points to encourage them to craft their own songs. While there are no mechanics to how songwriting works, Roberts creates an incentive via creativity points that players can use to improve their play. Additionally, Roberts instructs the players to reward creativity points to players who contribute to songwriting based on if it makes it into the song, which is through democratic vote within the band. This creates incentive to engage with musical literacy, but also to engage with musical literacy as a communal effort. Despite the claims that there are no rules in songwriting, Roberts acquiesces by providing guidelines that outline themes, style, and form of most punk songs in the following section entitled Songwriting for Idiots. Throughout Punk is Dead, Roberts provide components for a punk musical literacy in terms of extra musical meaning, social interaction, style, and form, as well as a system to engage with those ideas via musical creation. Additionally, Punk is Dead also establishes a sonic identity for its punk literacy with their official soundtrack for the game, performed by the punk band The Stereo Flowers, which we do not have time to listen to. By attaching these tracks to the game, Roberts provides a sonic template for the game's player to understand and internalize a punk sonic norm. Both Punk is Dead and Cyberpunk present their own versions of what punk is as a musical genre, a cultural force, and a social reality. And while we as scholars can determine what is fact and fiction about these representations, their proliferation of these literacies can help us examine how TTRPGs and play influence knowledge formation and understanding as we continue exploring imagined worlds, imagined sounds, and imagined punks. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Drew. Perfect. Perfect on the time. What a great way to kind of remind us all about how important music and sound is to the punk movement and identity. So that was a really great exploration of that. And your mention of cyberpunk is a great segue into our next one. So I'd like to introduce Cody Walizer, who will be talking about ninja futurism and magic and beyond. So I will hand it over to Cody.
Hi, thanks y'all. How's everybody doing? I hope everybody's doing well. Um, As you all know, if you've seen one of my presentations here before, and first and foremost, I'd like to thank AGS for having me back. I like to keep things interactive. We only have a short period of time, but I'm hoping to see the chat and the Discord over here really become lively. So before we begin, I was wanting to ask a question. When you think of a ninja, what comes to mind? And as you are populating the chat with that, I'll begin to introduce my talk. I will say if you're my friend and you didn't immediately answer me, then we have some type of problem that we'll have to work out later on. But yes, thank you, Emma, for teeing me up as well. My talk is titled Ninja Futurism and Magic and Beyond, the Ninja as a Cyberpunk Paradigm. And I am Cody Walizer. I am a professor in communication at the University of Colorado Boulder, and my emphasis is in rhetoric and technology. And this talk really bridges the gap between those two things. So I've broken my talk into 3 sections, although I reject linearity as much of the conference has continually reminded us to do. This is just the clearest way to organize my thoughts here. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is the figure of the ninja in the cyberpunk genre. The second thing that I'm going to talk about is a particular character within Magic the Gathering's setting Neon Dynasty. And then the last thing that I'm going to talk about or posit is a type of ninja futurism that I think we can draw a lot of potential from. Let's begin talking about the figure of the ninja within cyberpunk. And I thought it would be useful to just shout out some of my theoretical influences here, to be thinking about the different scholarship and the scholarly conversations that I'm trying to access. And so these 3 texts really stood out to me as being foundational texts for me. On the left, we have the collection of essays, but its own argument in and of itself, Techno-Orientalism. That's where we'll be basing a lot of the definitional framework for today's talk. In the middle is like my guiding light as far as game studies go. It's Tara Fickle's The Race Card, which the last AGS panel talk that I gave was about a ludic Orientalism or Ludo-Orientalism. Today, we'll be talking about Techno-Orientalism. And on the right-hand side is a really great book that just came out last year, Made in Asia/America, where I'm going to get some of the specific ninja content from today. So accessing that framework requires just basically asserting a basic premise for today's talk, which is that the origins of the cyberpunk genre involve Western anxieties about the East. And this is actually from George Yang's preview of Cyberpunk 2077, the game that came out in 2020 for Wired magazine. And one of the things that he references is the definition of techno-orientalism, which is the phenomenon of imagining Asia, Asianness, Asians, and hypo, or in this case, hyper, technological frameworks. And thinking about how those frameworks or those terms are put in use in both cultural production and in political discourse. So later on, the authors of Techno-Orientalism emphasize that Techno-Orientalism presents a broader, dynamic, and often contradictory spectrum of images constructed by the East and the West alike of an Orient undergoing rapid economic and cultural transformations. Hold on to that thought as we move on. The second part of the framework that I want to talk about is what I mentioned coming from Made in Asia/America and the essay in there, Chapter 7, Colonial Moments in Japanese Video Games by Rachel Hutchinson. And what she does, in my opinion, is she gives me the language. She synthesizes the language of 2 things. The first is the archetypal ninja for her, represented by Yuffie from Final Fantasy VII, as this kind of inherently contradictory, disjunctive, and multiplicative figure. And the second thing, the reason that that figure is disjunctive, multiplicative, contradictory is through a clash of its visual and narrative elements. So she gives us both the language of the archetype and the practice or the method of close reading characters, video game characters in her case, visual and narrative properties as a framework for engaging real world politics. And if you follow Magic the Gathering at all, you'll know that Yuffie herself was just represented on a magic card. And you can tell immediately that there are elements of the cyberpunk genre, the sort of broken factory scaffolding behind her. Obviously, the images of the ninja, the archetypal ninja that Rachel Hutchinson talks about are coming on strong here. But if you know anything about the Final Fantasy VII setting, the Shinra Corporation and all of those types of things, you will understand how she might fit. There is one thing that's important about Yuffie that I want you to really pay attention to, which is that you can see her face. We'll talk about that a little bit later on here. So this all brought me to a research question. As a person who studies rhetoric and technology, I am interested in how can we decode and decolonize the figure of the ninja as it is rhetorically constituted within the admittedly and problematically techno-orientalist cyberpunk genre. So what do we do with it? How do we teach it? How do we talk about it? And in terms of coming up with examples, there were just a bit too many. So here's where I have to not get bogged down to keep us all on time. There are several examples of video games, new and old, that have themes of technology, tradition, and culture overlapping, right? Some of them, like the ones on the top, Warframe and Ghost Runner, situate you as like a cyber ninja yourself. The ones on the bottom, Assassin's Creed Shadows and Ninja Gaiden 4, have that contrast between a technological overture and then the character themselves, which represents some type of clandestine tradition. On the right-hand side over here, we have anime all the way back to the 1970s. If you're interested in this work, we got to figure out a time to like have a co-watching session for Science Ninja Team Gatchaman, which is the anime from the 70s, all the way in the top left. There's Ninja Robots Tobikage, Shinobi no Itoki, Ninja Kamui. All of these pop culture references demonstrate a consistent theme of cyberpunk and ninjas being together. And while I was thinking about it, I was like, one of the great examples of cyberpunk ninjas is this character in Fortnite. And I was like, there's also Shredder, who's in Fortnite, and Lego Ninjago. And I guess Lego is just Fortnite. And then there's Mortal Kombat, right? Which is in Fortnite as of last season, I think it was. And then there's Metal Gear Solid, which is, of course, in Fortnite. There's the biohack ninjas from Iron Man. And Iron Man's in Fortnite. And there's no other reason to associate the figure of the ninja with Fortnite, right? Okay, cool. I thought not. Moving on. So the idea here should be pretty clear, right? There's a lot of overlap. And of course, that overlap does not evade the tabletop setting or genre. We have things like Shadowrun. Here's the cover for the most recent edition of the game. And a mini on top, already referenced in many panels so far, has been the Cyberpunk tabletop role-playing game, which is a mini there in the bottom quadrant. We have Yu-Gi-Oh! And other tabletop card games that reference this type of figure. And really all I'm wondering at this point for you is, which cyberpunk ninjas did I miss that you would have loved to see included? Now, I do have another point to all of this, which is to say that ninjas and technology are not just limited to the realms of characters or popular culture. In fact, there may be a ninja in your kitchen. Mine is a pressure cooker. And the idea of all of this, right, is that there's something about the figure of the ninja, often a masked figure whose face that you cannot see, and technology that is compelling, that taps directly into this techno-orientalist framework to be certain, but also has some underlying potential or meaning. For example, what would it mean to enroll your child into a program to become a code ninja, right? Why would you do that? What are the rhetorical aspects of making a choice like that? And so that brings me to our subject for today, which is Neon Dynasty. If you know anything about me, you know that I love Kamigawa, but you may not know anything about Kamigawa. So this setting was originally put into Magic, published in the early 2000s as a classical feudal Japan. Everyone needs this own setting. Actually, a long story short, it came from a random inclusion of a D&D character who was a samurai, all the way down from people who played Magic to create this setting, right? So some of the publishers of Magic were playing D&D, and now we ended up with this whole thing. Well, in 2022, they decided to redo the Kamigawa setting. And what better way to redo it, they decided, than to bring it into the sort of modern or cyberpunk aesthetic. And so immediately for me, alarm bells are going off. The discourse around this setting was very much like, wait a second, doesn't this tap into all of the Orientalist framing? And as far as the visuals go, they didn't really do a very good job of avoiding that critique. And you can see that in the construction of Kaito himself and his concept art, right? He is quintessentially Japanese. He is quintessentially ninja. He even has a katana that is also shuriken, right? Like there's just no way around all of the different symbols that are being included that might make us sort of squint and say, this is a little bit over the top, right? There are so many different elements of it that are just unmistakably both of these things put together. And that bears itself out in the setting as well. For heaven's sakes, they made a fake language, a version of Japanese to animate their neon signs, right? So there's all of these different problems. And I think for me, the saving grace began with the narrative as opposed to the visuals. And the symbol right in the middle here, this Tanuki robot that is jumping out at you, is the symbol that I think saves the day. So what is Kaito as a symbol in the narrative versus as these admittedly very problematic visual symbols? In the narrative, Kaito is a resident of the Imperial Palace, the symbol of authority in Kamigawa. And he is studying in the Imperial Palace. He's so prodigious, in fact, that his best friend is the Emperor. And you can see them on the left-hand side on a story spotlight card right there. As you can see from the totally way too good, like it doesn't deserve to be this good anime trailer for Kamigawa on the right-hand side, Kaito loses his best friend, the Emperor, to a magical phenomenon called a Planeswalker spark, which means that she can now roam the multiverse, although her spark is unstable and brings her to different locations against her will. So he begins searching. And through his search, he begins to work for another over-the-top representation of cyberpunk and ninja put together, Satoru Umezawa. And through this work and through the visual representations, we continue to get these kind of very similar themes, right? He's deceptive, he's violent, he's sort of looking over a maybe bigger enemy than him, as you can see on the card on the very, very bottom right there. And yes, for Fist of the North Star fans, that is a Hara Tetsuo art right there in the middle. I'm excited about the remake as well. But Kaito is still visually represented in this problematic way. It is only through the narrative understanding of who his Tanuki is, which gives him his own planeswalker powers, that you begin to realize that there could be something such as ninja futurism. And so how do I answer the research question that I posed at the beginning of this talk? Well, there's basically two things that I want to talk about. The first is that I see Kaito Shizuki as a paradigmatic example of the tension present in the cyberpunk genre. He is negotiating that tension himself. The clashes between visuals, setting, and narrative rhetorically situate him as a futurist who is struggling with how to negotiate technology and the spirit realm, or the realm of nature. And I want to posit ninja futurism as a term that we can use to describe how we can reimagine ninjas as liberatory figures. So Kaito's description immediately gives us some sense of how this works. It describes him as a risk taker at heart, with few qualms about breaking the rules. Couldn't be more punk than that. Kaito pursues technological progress to make his home plane of Kamigawa a better place for himself and his sister, who also happens to be an Imperial police officer. And within the context of the story, it says, but Kaito was a futurist whose core beliefs were to push the limits of technology for the greater good. If Kaito's story ended here, I think we wouldn't be able to have much discussion. But what it includes is his marriage of a spirit known as Himoto with that little robot figurine that you see, which gives him his planeswalker spark. In fact, that is his mask. So any other time that you see him, you usually see his face, which situates him as a full person, as a main character, and as somebody whose visage you are continually reminded has importance. The only time when it is obscured is when it is obscured by that blend of both the spiritual and the technological, when he dons his spirit companion as his mask. And throughout the story, we see a lot of this kind of theme of him being a heroic defender, despite his relationship with laws and rules evolving and changing over time. And my gosh, do they love the Kaito is reaching out for the Emperor, or the Emperor is reaching out for Kaito image, as there is there in the middle. But yes, there is the Phyrexia invasion, and Kaito is a hero of the plane, defending his plane from invaders. Unfortunately for all of us, the card on the right was only given to WotC employees and is not playable, although if it was, it'd probably be my favorite card ever. And maybe I'll just print it one day and bring a booster box of Kamigawa around with me. And again, if his story stopped here, we may not find a way to theorize ninja futurism very well. But I was very shocked last year to see Kaito's inclusion in the horror set of Magic the Gathering. And I think this is where we actually get the clearest picture of what ninja futurism is. So Kaito follows Nashi, an unsuspecting ninja of his own right, who is looking for his long-lost mother, into a plane of horror. The entire plane, the entire dimension is a haunted house. And Kaito puts together a ragtag team as he would in any horror narrative, and he gets lost as you would in any horror narrative and confronts the broader structure of the demon who inhabits the house. And what he does, once again, is he marries technology with spiritual magic, divine magic, with the magic of the planes themselves in order to find his way through the house and then finally to overcome it. And the name of this card, I do not think is an accident. This card to me is the reason why I see Kaito as a paradigmatic example of what ninja futurism means to me. Not just the reference to Jordan Peele's movie, but the idea that we can get out of our present circumstances, which continue to haunt us, which the entire world is sort of structured around this unbreakable formation of the haunted house, right? We've seen a lot of presentations earlier about how our current circumstances, the status quo, is haunted. It is something to be, maneuvering through tactically and with the notion that there's a scary thing that could go bump in the middle of the night anytime around the corner. And so this flavor text to me gives us the idea of ninja futurism in a nutshell. It says, Kaito's blade brought the light of another plane into Duskborn, and with it, a brief chance to escape. And so I want you all to consider, as I'm concluding this presentation, where do you see the power and potential of ninja futurism? What ninja aesthetics do you see in protest, in hip hop, in other liberatory spaces of art and design that are meaning to use the tools that we have at our disposal in new and interesting ways? That's to me what Kaito means and what Kaito gives us access to talk about. So as we conclude, I want you to pop it in the chat. What potential, if any, do you see in ninja futurism? And I'm really looking forward to having a Q&A session. Thanks again for having me, and thanks again for moderating, Emma.
Thank you so much, Cody. That was great. Wonderful slides, too. Very engaging. I did want to point out really quick, too, when you were asking about like what are some other ninja figures that people could think of. Evan made a really interesting point where he says there are ninjas up and down culture from the 1970s on. I just didn't realize the extent to which they never stopped being used. So it's the sort of pervasive kind of figure that you are bringing some new attention to, which is really exciting. All right, well,
Awesome.
thank you,
Thanks.
Cody. Go ahead and answer his fun question in the chat. And if you have questions, please go ahead and start popping those in the Q&A box. And for our final paper on this panel, I would like to introduce Austin Anderson and D.A. Hall. And they will be presenting to us on the bad guy is capitalism, which I think we can all agree with. So I will hand it over to you guys. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Hello, my name is Austin, and David will be sharing the screen. All right, and with the introduction out of the way, we'll go ahead and get started. The Bad Guys Capitalism, Notes on Punk and Camp in Actual Plays. And so it's taken as a given often that the popular is antithetical to the punk. Once punk goes mainstream, its subversive potential allegedly ceases, and it becomes a commodity. Under this view, punk projects are unsustainable in late-stage capitalism, a condition Mark Fisher calls capitalist realism, where any transgressive art form is co-opted, while leaving behind the widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but also that's impossible to even imagine a coherent alternative to it. Under this regime, Crass was right in 1978 when they declared punk is dead, it's just another cheap product for the consumer's head. Yet, should it be taken as a given that popular punk is an oxymoron? We think not.
Instead, we argue that such views are self-defeating, with reference to the ostensibly liberatory project of punk. We interweave the history and practice of punk and TTRPG communities through the concept of camp, in order to show that popularity is not the death of these spaces, but rather their basis. Through competing analyses of Dimension 20 and Critical Role, we use camp to invert the question as to whether a popular object can be punk by showing how a thoughtful commitment to the subversive aesthetic practice at the heart of both TTRPG and punk communities is in fact necessary to sustaining and growing their popular project. In other words, a popular punk project is not a contradiction in terms, but rather precisely the liberatory horizon of the movement.
So very briefly stated, the history of this. TTRPGs and punk subcultures both co-emerged in the 1970s as alternative communities responding to the tumultuous political situations of the Cold War and rapidly dissolving New Deal order. Both developed communal practices with distinct aesthetics and slang, and both were vilified by the Satanic Panic of the 1980s. And despite offering a refuge from mainstream hegemonic culture, both spaces were fraught with gatekeeping, while where certain members sought to use definitions like real geeks or real punks, weaponizing authenticity as an exclusionary tool. In the context of TTRPGs, Aaron Trammell has described how geeks see themselves as outsiders because they've been empowered by white privilege, yet feel excluded from the domain of hegemonic masculinity to which they feel entitled. And similarly, punks forged a construction of authenticity that distinguished real from fake, leading to a subculture where, in the words of Marcus Clayton, punks of color are continually left drowning in those waters.
However, the origins of punk are in the rejection of these normalizing processes. It's meant to make a highly visible and legible statement against the proper and good ways of life as being arbitrary and aristocratically defined. Seen through this lens, one can recognize punk as a form of camp, not the naive camp of a project that commits thoroughly to sustaining those norms and fails so spectacularly that it becomes a compelling statement on the reverse, but the intentional camp that Sontag ascribes to, among others, Oscar Wilde. This second category of camp begins with the fundamental commitment to exposing the absurdity and unreality of any given aspect of the capitalist real, which is to say, the category of the real as such. Butler's later intervention on the performativity of gender examines drag as a performance of gender so camp that the reality or origin point of gender is evaporated. Campy goth punk outfits such as Bauhaus and Sushi and the Banshees, and the queer icons that emerge from that lineage, explode the revered aesthetic sensibility of the gloomy Victorian aristocrat, and thereby subvert the category of the normal. As Sontag and Butler point out, however, camp ceases to be camp when it begins to reinforce rather than subvert the structure it emerges out of, which happens when it takes itself too seriously, and especially when it begins constructing its own aristocracy that is authorized to define and recognize good camp versus bad camp. As we have shown, this process of exclusion, originating as it so often does in race, gender, and class distinctions, occurred in both the punk and TTRPG communities.
And so rather than accepting these exclusions as inevitable, we propose that punk's original anti-establishment impulse can be reclaimed through interstitial approaches that reject gatekeeping. John Holloway's Crack Capitalism offers a framework that asks us to break capitalism in as many ways as we can to try to expand and multiply the cracks. This approach works by building inclusive communities within existing structures rather than demanding total ideological purity. Camp functions as precisely this kind of interstitial practice, using popular accessibility to expose power structures rather than retreating into exclusionary notions of authenticity. Popular punk represents the most effective form of this interstitial resistance.
And in the interest of not taking ourselves too seriously, we're going to talk about the importance of being camp. So, the explosion in popularity of actual plays, specifically those of Dungeons and Dragons, represents precisely the kind of crack that we're talking about. They use mainstream platforms and co-opt aesthetics to denaturalize that which is taken as natural. I was once asked in a sort of attempted gotcha moment what the genre of Dungeons and Dragons was. And my interlocutor was under the assumption that I wouldn't be able to answer, and he could thereby reveal that the problem with D&D was that it didn't know what it was. But I responded that it's pulp fantasy. The popularity of the system can, of course, be attributed to successful ad campaigns, but I think it's worth noting that each iterative edition has been designed to make the system more recognizable and accessible to a wider audience. And as a result of that methodology, the system is constructed from the highly available images, tropes, and aesthetics of pulp magazines and dime novel fantasy adventures, which can then be endlessly reconfigured. D&D therefore lends itself to camp performances of fantasy. When we play, we don't play Tolkien's Aragorn, we play something like Aragorn in drag. Or we play Slap Happy Jack, whose jokey premise as a pie-slinging clown is familiar to anyone who's played D&D. In one of the first campaigns run with Gygax and his friends, one of the player characters was a cowboy wizard who holstered his magic wands like six-shooters. So part of what inspired my interest in this topic in the first place was the drop-off in viewership during and in the wake of Season 3 of Critical Role. As a brief disclaimer, I want to emphasize that my intention is not to criticize either the cast and crew of Critical Role or the many fans who enjoy their content. But there has been unmistakably a decline in viewership across both YouTube, their primary platform, and Twitch, a more recent endeavor. Here we can see a precipitous decline from the heights of Season 1 to the heavily criticized end of Season 3. I could spend more time talking about the narrative problems of the show, such as what it means to position Vox Machina as civic champions, or the inevitable apocalypse that defined the adventures of Bell's Hells. But what's crucial to recognize for this present argument is the way in which Critical Role attempts to be a very serious project. Jokes are in the room still, but more and more they are merely a distraction from the dramatic interpersonal relationships and world-defining narrative arcs that are at the core of the show. And as we've seen, the seriousness has simply not landed for the majority of the audience, because that's not really what D&D is good at. This is what D&D is good at. The second frame, the emotional impact that arises and emerges from absurdity organically, at which point the camp performance, gives the lie to good and bad taste by laying bare these universal fundamental emotions that underlie all aesthetic experience.
And in contrast to Critical Role, Dimension 20 exemplifies the popular punk through its camp approach to genre. As the on-screen image shows, every season targets a specific genre, from John Hughes films to Victorian murder mysteries to Harry Potter. But the show camps each genre, subverting the ideology within. For instance, The Crown of Candy, the show transforms the epic high fantasy series A Song of Ice and Fire into a world where noble houses are literally made of candy, and sugary royalty clash over serious political conflict, exemplifying Sontag's intentional camp, where the point of camp is to dethrone the serious. Through this campy approach, D20 uses popular genres to critique oppressive ideologies, and this pattern repeats across D20's catalog. For instance, in The Unsleeping City, it exemplifies D20's camp approach to genre. Told over 2 seasons, The Unsleeping City is set in a modern-day New York City, secretly filled with magic. Taking a camp approach to urban fantasy, D20 makes late-stage capitalism the supernatural threat harming everyday New Yorkers. As Emma French observes, Mulligan makes the realities of the real world into intruders, subverting urban fantasy's typical paradigm where fantastical forces threaten normalcy. Instead, figures like Robert Moses, reimagined as a lich seeking to monopolize the American dream, and Null, a void that embodies social isolation, represent monstrous threats to the citizenry, a threat that can only be defeated by community making and the dreams of New York City itself, represented by the Vox Populi and Vox Phantasma, respectively. And despite the seriousness of this mission, the series remains camp, offering a world filled with magical bodega cats, giant rat kings, and a mall punk embodying the spirit of the Jersey Devil. These campy references do not cease the anti-capitalist punk politics of the seasons, but rather help disseminate a politically transgressive message via a campy play with genre.
By using the trappings of urban fantasy to present a real-world political practice, Unsleeping City makes good on theoretical commitments that have informed Dimension as a project from its inception. Now, anarchist halflings aside, moments such as these make clear the well-constructed philosophical frame that informs the radical politics of the show. Here, Brennan presents the same form of esoteric nihilism that has served as the theoretical basis for much anarchist and communist radical thought for decades. The absurdity of Ali's response to this philosophical fastball in conjuring a massive deific yes by no means detracts from the impact of the moment. Rather, their commitment to the absurd campiness of the show totally fulfills the premise here offered by Brennan. Hence the importance of Never After, which offers a meta-aesthetic statement within the trajectory of the theory and practice offered by Fantasy High and Unsleeping City, respectively. The world of Never After is fundamentally interstitial. It's a fractured world where the hope of change emerges from the conceptual wiggle room at the edge or boundaries of stories, where they touch one another. Where the princesses seek to annihilate the world, Committing to the apocalyptic pessimism of anti-capitalism within capitalist realism, the fairies seek to maintain the status quo. But rather than accepting this dyad and choosing a side, and rather than taking the power which sustains it for themselves, the intrepid heroes disperse their power across the populace of Never After, quite literally giving every individual the power to self-authorize. It's no coincidence that this moment takes place in a campy goth Disney send-up. Disney, well-known purveyor of fantasy as hyperreality that has its origins in Walt Disney's deep-held fascist convictions, Disney is in many ways the American cultural project the contemporary camp runs counter to, which is perhaps why we side-eye our quote-unquote Disney queens.
And while we mentioned Critical Role's declining popularity, the opposite appears to be true with D20. Dropout, their streaming platform, doubled subscribers in 2024, bucking the trend of other streaming services in that year. D20 likewise sold out Madison Square Garden earlier this year, and they have done this while practicing what they preach, offering profit sharing to the entire cast and crew, which even extends to performers for their labor during auditions, something practically unheard of. All the while, D20 continues to make the argument that late-stage capitalism is an oppressive system, which we can only overcome through community. It is camp. It is popular punk. It takes very seriously the project of not taking oneself too seriously. Thank you so much.
Thank you for our time.
Oh, perfect timing. Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. There is a lot of appreciation for the hats going on in the Discord, so that's great. Wonderful. Well, at this point, then I will invite all of our panelists to go ahead and turn their cameras back on so we can go ahead and do our Q&A. For those of you who do have questions, please go ahead and put them in that Q&A box. And I'm going to start us out just because there are a bunch here that we're very excited to talk about ninjas. So we're going to go back to that one real quick and start there. And I'm going to kind of condense some of these together because I think, Cody, a lot of these questions were, or these are answers to your question about like, what do you think of when you think of ninja? So a lot of people said Ninja Turtles. That was in the Discord, but also here. And then somebody else, Meg, said a ninja is a stagehand dressed completely in black, including the face, totally visible if you know where to look, but understood to be invisible. So there's kind of this aspect of, what you see is not necessarily what you're supposed to see, or like, we have this agreement that they're invisible. And then Jason, who had to leave, so he's not here to hear the answer, but that's all right. He'll see the recording. He said, one of the interesting things about the ninja to me is that they could be anyone. In any sense, they are punk because how the people that are seen as the rabble or as commoners are also possibly the biggest danger the elite could face. And then he asks, is there a space for that in your ninja futurism? So I'll
Absolutely.
let
And
you take that.
yeah, I really appreciate that, Emma. And thanks. It was Jason who had the question.
Yes.
Really awesome question because that's something I was trying to get at with the idea that Kaito and Yuffie are these very recognizable faces, whereas most ninjas that you see, it could be anyone, as you had said. And so I think there is a dichotomy there. I'm not exactly sure how to handle it on like an aggregate scale, but in particular for the idea of the unknowable, it speaks to the issues of surveillance in an era where protest is, being tracked and censored and those types of things. Um, and so that's what I was getting at when I asked the question at the end. Do you see ninja in protest? Do you see ninja in hip hop or other spaces of resistance, in fashion and those types of things? And I think what you will often find is that idea of the mask, the idea of graffiti, the idea of leaving your mark and being unseen have a lot of crossover. And there's a powerful explanatory moment at which you can identify with a ninja. And that's what I think is interesting about Kaito and Yuffie. So that's where I think the dichotomy really explores itself. There is the unknowable, and then there is the figure that you can see yourself in. And there's something there that I want to play with and talk about its potential for. For sure, for me, the main thing to answer Jason's question is about that idea of surveillance and sort of escaping the eye of the state and the powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that answer. Um, I do have another one also about ninjas, so I'm just going to go with that one, and then we can probably move on to another topic. I have some burning questions for you all that's going to weave them all together. But
Cool.
one last question here from Louis or Louis, I'm not sure, says, since the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles have been an enduring IP and will continue to be, how do they and other media for young audiences, you mentioned Fortnite, right, differ in terms of ninja and cyberpunk imagery from media for more mature audiences? So how do these depictions inform young audiences' expectations of ninja and cyberpunk?
Wow, that's really interesting. I mean, I was struck by the question, even in relation to the other question, which is like you go to a Spirit Halloween or whatever, and you will find dozens of ninja costumes for kids. And like the figure of the ninja is something that kids find to be really compelling and interesting. We talked about like the non-pop culture ways, like Code Ninja or Ninja Tech AI or those types of things. So I think in some ways they're taught about ninjas in like a very general sense, and that's where Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles also I feel like comes in. They're sort of divorced from the traditional Japanese setting, right? Like the whole story is that Splinter finds like a ninjutsu book in the sewer and teaches himself ninjutsu, and then like teaches the Ninja Turtles. So for me, I think it's maybe a part of it is like this historical disconnection of like ninjas in the New York City sewers, and another part of it is the idea that they are explicitly heroic. Some more, serious or adult themed stories, I think, get more at that like anti-hero vision of a ninja. Especially Kaito is sort of situated as that, right? He's like breaking the laws and causing his imperial family members and loved ones stress and things like that, but he's still sort of doing things for the greater good. Whereas the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are outcasts because of their identity position as like these mutant animals. And so that's how I would picture it, is that the ways in which they're outside the law or the power structure are a little bit more palatable for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. In a way, the absurd is a little bit more understandable there. And they're explicitly heroic, whereas, some of the more like adult themed ninjas would toe that line. I'm thinking particularly of things that are really violent and based in like a Japanese history, like Sekiro, which is one of my favorite video games, or my favorite video game, where it's like so rooted in the Japanese context and the context of like Sengoku Jidai and this violent warring states period, that vision of just being a hero is certainly contested from the start.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much for that answer. All right, I'm going to ask a question to all of you, and then I'm going to bring it back to the audience questions if you are coming in. But I did know, one of the things that struck me when I was listening to all of your papers, and also when I was rereading the abstracts ahead of time, is to me, it feels like there is just this really important thread of affect and emotion and sensation and what all of you are talking about. And to kind of pick up on what Mikael started with, but this idea of disenchantment and what it means to kind of feel that tension, and then finding other modes of punk as a praxis, to come back to the where we ended with Austin and DA, right? The popular punk praxis. And a way of, I know Cody, you mentioned also like making do with what we have. You'd said something to that nature. And then Drew is bringing in how important it is to have these identities that are constructed from music literacy, and how music itself is kind of constrained in different ways. But I really wanted to hear what you all had to say about like sensations and sensibilities, and how that speaks to how you're thinking about punk. I hope that's not too amorphous there, but I'm just going to throw it at you.
Yeah, absolutely. I that strikes a chord with part of something that I wish I had had more time to talk about, which is the sort of the like the how punk gives the lie, how punk as camp gives the lie to like what is defined as high culture. The sort of the Oscar Wilde of it all, I guess, would be that um the things that are sort of aristocratically defined as high art, high culture, etc. It attempts to put a monopoly on a particular form of affect and feeling as evoked by art. And what I find compelling in camp and punk is the way in which those things are evoked not not as like high culture, but as quite specifically not high culture. And in fact, in many ways, rejecting high culture and pointing out that it's all based on the same like primary affective experiences, and monopolizing that is dangerous and deeply oppressive in terms of like wrangling what our feelings are allowed to be and what we are allowed to feel about. When the truth is we are always feeling all the time about all things, and the aesthetic process of like trying to channel that is one of the primary ways in which state authority, cultural authority, capitalist authority is expressed.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, DA. Did anyone else want to tackle that question?
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm sort of just gonna point to and leave there and surreptitiously duck away once I've done so is not speaking only to Mage the Ascension, but also the World of Darkness games as a whole. I think in sort of talking about that diode of the Gothic and the Punk, which they sort of collapse into this single framework, the World of Darkness by default is described as like a very gray setting, not just sort of morally gray and ambiguous, but also sort of affectively flat and gray. The Gothic side, by contrast, sort of creates a high degree of emotional valence towards the somber and the macabre and the depressing, whereas the Punk then sort of heightens things in the opposite direction towards the aggravated and agitated and outraged. And so I think, at least in terms of talking about that as a game setting and the way that emotion plays into it, affect becomes an aesthetic framework for sort of navigating the World of Darkness as well, and then also sort of setting the tone and expectations, perhaps in some ways, for your respective vision of the World of Darkness that might be happening at your table as well.
Yeah, thank you, Mikael. Drew, would you like to add on to that? That just made me think, if we're thinking about aesthetic and affect, how does that correlate with what you're talking about?
Yeah, it's very interesting thinking about punk, and all of these papers have made me think about a lot of things, especially with DA and Austin, in terms of the bit as punk praxis, because whenever I think of D20, I think of the bit, right? And where does the bit fit in whenever we talk about TTRPGs? And it is kind of like the punk is hope kind of idea. I like in literally like an hour and a half, I have to run across town to go play a game of Death in Space, which Merkborg hack. You're going to die in space, kind of like the hopelessness of that. And it's the most bit heavy game I've ever played in my entire life. We fly around as space janitors in a floating gay bar, right? It's the praxis of playing and being absurdist in the times that we live in is the punk praxis of TTRPGs, right? Even if we don't land on the aesthetics, Cyberpunk really tries to be punk and it's super not punk, at least in an 1988 version. I haven't read Cyberpunk Red. Whereas Punk is Dead is very punk because it puts that in its center of its praxis, right? So the idea of sense and sensibility is the aesthetic of it, is the heart of it, or the sensibility of it, what drives us forward. I think it's the bit is hope is where I'm going to land on it.
Love that. Thank you. Cody, did you have anything you wanted to add to that part before I
Yeah,
move on?
I mean, just really quickly, I would say, piggybacking off what Drew just said, a lot of Kaito's voice lines in the digital client for Magic Arena are just straight up bits. and they're really funny, right? You'll do something, one of his planeswalker abilities or something like that, and he'll be like, now you see me, now you don't. And those like real moments of playing up and hamming up the character also come out in the narrative. So if you're interested more in that, read the Duskmourn or listen to, I think there's an audio version of the Duskmourn narratives, which the narratives in Magic often do get left behind, but I find that's where a lot of the rhetorical meaning is constructed and borne out.
Awesome, thank you. I feel like you're going to need to put a list of all of your recommended reading and watching for us if you haven't already, Cody. Just following up on that great motto, which we are all obsessed with now, Drew, thank you, the bit as hope, bit is or as hope. So that connects with some of our other audience questions here, kind of about this idea of engaging with comedy and lightheartedness and seriousness, and how punk really occupies that point of tension between those two. So Zoheb wanted to say to David and Austin, on that topic of camp and seriousness, it reminds him of the work of Bong Joon-ho. Bong's work at its best fuses pathos and humor together, often in the same scene. Given the international popularity of Bong's work, coupled with the popularity of actual play, Zoheb wonders why we struggle analytically with the idea of comedy as compatible with the seriousness in art. And I know, Dia, you'd already sort of started talking about that when you were talking about high art and low art, so maybe we could go back to that. And I'll just throw in there, there's also a question, very important. Are your cowboy hats a statement on what kind of hat is the most campy?
Yeah, so the hats are actually a statement on what campy hat we both owned. I think we had a variety of hats, but this is the shared camp between me and Austin. This is where we can meet in the middle. But kind of speaking on some of these, I think actually both of the questions in the Q&A right now, to a certain degree, I think it's interesting that okay, so first of all my cards on the table, the question of whether or not we can ever think about comedy or satire has plagued me for my entire career, and is one of the things that I'm constantly worrying over, because it does feel like we miss the joke all the time, right? That's such a common thing in scholarship to read and see, oh, you've completely missed the joke, and you're kind of going on this sort of wild tangent all the way down the line. But the basic premise is that it was satire to begin with, so none of this really, it doesn't follow, or you're just saying what the thing is already saying because you're just agreeing with the satirical project. To that end, though, I think it is interesting to think about, like, what does it mean to have comedy with tragedy arising out of it versus tragedy that has comedy arising out of it? Can we draw these like hard generic distinctions? What does it mean when we begin collapsing those things? And I think that to answer the last remaining question here, I think of the like Bong Joon-ho corpus as more of the latter, right? As deep tragedy that has comedy arising out of it. And I think of Dimension 20's like Fantasy High, et cetera, as comedy with tragedy that arises out of it. But I do think if we're looking at like new genre, what that would mean, my like impulse, my instinct is to say that the time that I experienced the moment of thinking, wow, they think this is new, was when I was watching the Critical Role, the Downfall, the Brennan campaign, the one shot where, not one shot, the mini series where he does the apocalyptic thing that happens before some of the other Critical Role campaigns, because it's improvised tragedy, and it doesn't scan as it feels extremely powerful and new in a way that I was not expecting to have. What does it mean? We know improv comedy. What is improv tragedy going to do? How does it work? And I think it absolutely works incredibly well there. So that's just kind of like some of my scattered thoughts.
Excellent, thank you. Did anyone else want to add on to that topic? All right. I'll just throw in there too. This is a topic that I love as well, so I'm so excited we kind of ended up in this space. It always makes me think of my favorite campy piece of theater, which is Titus Andronicus, Shakespeare's, which is like horrendously gory, but the way to do it correctly is like to make it campy, right? And then my favorite line is when Titus is asked, like, why are you crying or why are you laughing? And he says, why I have not another tear to shed. Right. So is that part of our punk praxis then? Is that it's laughter in the face of like, we laugh because if we don't laugh, we cry. What do you all think of that?
Uh, I feel this in a very visceral and in real way, in uh, normalized absurdist scholarship kind of deal where we're in the space where we're in. Uh, I would not say what I do is punk, but the idea of whenever I was starting my dissertation, I wanted explicitly the aesthetics of joy or the aesthetics of things that come out of scholarship, not to be um, uh, based in reality, which is deeply tragic, but still based in reality, but is deeply hopeful or deeply joyful, right? And I think absurdism and punk kind of go together in a lot of ways. Um, Whether it's in terms of aesthetics and camp or in terms of I quoted Christy Lohman is this, punks are anti-system because they can't agree on what system to be anti against. It's anti all systems. It doesn't matter to the system that it is, you're anti that particular system. So there's not a cohesive idea of punk other than um, resistance and resistance in the worlds that we live in, which is absurdist whenever we think about living that as a praxis. So I don't think that was an answer to your question, but
No, it's great.
I
Yeah,
yeah.
absurdism.
I think to sort of piggyback off that, if I may, when I think about, I'm like I'm a white man approaching his 40s, so of course I'm getting very interested in World War II for some reason. Like it's like a biological clock, it turns out. And thinking about resistance in occupied France or thinking about allied saboteurs, one of the sort of the if you look at the history, I suppose one of the major errors that the Nazi regime made was in overlooking things that they didn't deem serious or didn't deem to be serious threats, like the people of the countries that they occupied. And those who did become saboteurs, they didn't use, in order to dismantle a munitions factory, they used everyday objects like candle wax and sand to essentially destroy the machinery that put out instruments of war. And so I think as we talk about sort of comedy and absurdity, and we talk about seriousness and games, like these themes sort of, at least for me, collide in a very specific way to suggest that we overlook, and this is also a disciplinary thing as well, that we overlook the unserious at our own peril, and that the unserious can actually be quite serious as well.
Yeah,
Thank you, Mikael.
jumping off of those 2 points, I think I often think about sort of it's Stuart Hall kind of reflecting on Lukács and speaking on the fact that revolution is tragedy, that it's not we like to think of it in heroic terms. We like to think of it in comedic terms. We like to think of it as like a grand, beautiful victory. But in fact, what the actual process is the end of a tragic, horrific failure. It's the thing that must arise from the contradictions and the failures and the violences that we exist inside of. Revolution is necessarily a tragic event, but it's one that, as Andronicus points out, we ought to laugh at, right? It is the laughing tragedy of it all.
Yeah, and I think as I'm hearing all you respond to this, it also makes me think that it can go both ways too, right? Because of our I would say that like the stereotypical idea of what a punk is not someone who is playful or funny, right? A punk is usually someone who's very stoic, potentially angry, potentially violent. Like that's like the stereotype of that image. But I wonder if that too is the similar kind of attempt to balance that tension between the tragic and the comic, if we're going to use that dichotomy there, right? Because if the world around you is pretending that everything is fine or that everything's just a joke, right? Then you have to suddenly counterbalance that with a different kind of approach. So it's about like finding these ways to manage that sense of disenchantment and how we can do that. Um, so in our last couple minutes, I just wanted to call attention to a question that did not quite get answered. I saw, Austin, you typed an answer to it, but I just wanted to bring it up so everyone could hear it. But JJ Dorfman had asked on the subject of camp as punk. In your discussion of D20, you credit their longevity to their camping of various genres. Do you think there is space in this punk space for creating a new genre rather than parodying and interrogating the old? And can we bring this spirit to something that isn't bound by past genres, something bold and experimental? So, Austin, if you'd like to paraphrase your answer out loud, you're welcome to. But I also just wanted to open this up to everyone else as a nice place to kind of wrap up, is thinking about how all the things that you've been talking about have been interacting with past uh, archetypes or past ideologies or past events, and how we are then responding to those pasts as we move into the future.
And I can just very quickly wrap up or summarize it's the question. It's the authenticity thing, right? Of like this idea that to fit with this in particular brand of genre, whatever that genre may be, you have to be authentically following the codes and tropes of that. And I mentioned in my response is like, I think a very clear iteration of that is like Beyonce's Cowboy Carter, Little Nas X, and all of these Black artists making country music over the last like 4 or 5 years, and being for reasons that people will put more nuance than maybe I would, being rejected from the country community for not adhering to the genre tropes allegedly, and that in I think for most people's interpretation is being deployed for a very particular reason from their positionality. And I think something similar happens with punk, right? And some with punk rock and with indie rock of this idea, and often it's that popular idea. So now that this punk band has become popular, now they can't be transgressive or politically active in any kind of way.
Thank you, Austin. Yeah, did any of you else have other thoughts to wrap up on that point?
I think for me, I mean, connecting to the last response here, and trying to tie some things together that are still rattling around a little bit. One thing that we have also seen, my dissertation was about Colin Kaepernick and the NFL anthem protests. The idea of legitimate or authentic protest, to branch off of what Austin was just saying there. And what I'm really interested in, to tie that in with the humor piece, is how, I'm not going to name names here to be too specific, but how recent protests especially have focused on the idea of camp and ridicule and humor as the way to kind of like upset the established order or to reflect the absurdism of current administrations, plural, back onto them. So that's where my mind immediately went. And I really appreciated being on the panel with y'all to help me think through those types of things.
Thank you, Cody. All right, Mikael or Drew, do you have any final words for us? All right, well, thank you so much to all of my panelists, Cody, Mikael, Drew, DA, and Austin. You were all wonderful. Thank you so much. As a reminder, everyone, the day is not quite over. We're going to have a nice 29-minute break. And then please come back for our final presidential lecture with Aaron Trammell, who will be talking about punk and also the last 10 years of AGS. So get some water, take a stretch break, have a snack, and we'll see you in 28 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much.